appreciate y'all taking time out of your evening to be able to allow me to share some information with you that I'm always excited about sharing because it points to, is the Bible reliable? Can we trust what it says? And we're particularly going to be talking about the account of Noah's flood, or the worldwide flood, given in Genesis. And again, real quickly, just want to give some information again. My name's Jesse, for those who don't know me. I graduated from a one-year training program in Grand Junction, Colorado, that's associated with Alpha Omega Institute. Alpha Omega Institute is still going. The one-year training program, they're still trying to see if they can keep that going with recruits, but otherwise you can still find great resources at Alpha Omega Institute. And a lot of these slides and information that I'm going to share with you, I've basically gotten from them, so I want to give them pretty much the bulk of the credit for tonight's information. So again, we're talking about Noah's flood, and sadly some people struggle with believing it. In some cases it might be because growing up in Sunday school you see pictures like this, sadly sometimes on the wall, and you think, oh yeah, it's kind of childish, and how did he jam all those animals onto that ark? Look how crowded they are. There's no way that that could have been achieved. And so it becomes kind of more childlike fantasy sometimes when these are the pictures that arise when it comes to Noah's flood. But again, we need to look at the scriptural account that talks about how large this ship really was. And we're given the size in cubits, 300 cubits long, and a cubit basically is a measurement from the bottom of your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. And of course, everyone's cubit is a little different, so there's a little rough variations of how long it was, but ultimately somewhere between the range of 450 to 520 feet long is this ship, which is basically the size of 1.5 football fields long. And it wasn't just one deck, it had 3 decks. So you have 1.5 football fields stacked 3 on top of each other. So this is a lot of space on this ship. They are not all just popping out of the windows and crammed on the deck of the ship, but no, there's a lot of space, and this is a very massive ark that was being built. Now again, there's still some questions that arise. How many animals were on the ark? How could 8 people tend to all those creatures? We have a wonderful resource out there that you can look at those questions and see what answers are given. I won't go into that very much here, but again, we are kind of looking at, can we trust a biblical account? And of course, another question would be, well, how can we trust any account of history? I mean, has anyone seen George Washington? Did he even exist? Do we even know that we've learned that he did, he actually did? Is there any video proof nowadays? We'd say, show me a video, and I'll believe it. Well, is there any video proof of George Washington? No. So then why do we believe the accounts of George Washington? Well, because there's reliable historical documentation that talks about him. And there's actually historical documentation about a worldwide flood outside of the Bible. Yeah, there's actually one called the Mesopotamian cuneiform tablet, which talks about a worldwide flood. It dates to about 1600 BC. This is outside of Hebrew Jewish biblical context here. This is another nation talking about a worldwide flood. Another one is the Babylonian cuneiform rolls that also talk about a worldwide flood as well. Now, sadly, some people have looked at those and said, oh, well, because some of these date upwards of hundreds to maybe 1,000 years before the time of Moses, maybe the Jews just borrowed these stories from these other sources. But maybe we should look at some of these sources and see, do they really line up to say, oh yeah, clearly the Jews borrowed from them? Well, this Babylonian clay cuneiform tablet, it talks about the ark, so to speak, as being this massive corsicle, or basically this large bowl, you might say, that's what all the animals were put on. That was about 220 feet in diameter. And you can only imagine that thing floating around the ocean. Not very possible that was actually a real life situation that they could have survived out on the open seas in such a structure, according to the Babylonian clay cuneiform dimensions given. What about the Gilgamesh epic? The Gilgamesh epic also talks about a worldwide flood, and then it also talks about an ark, animals being taken on, birds being sent out during the flood, ark landing on a mountain, and it even talks about sacrifices being offered after the ark landed. And And of course, people will say, oh, well, the Bible just borrowed from the Gilgamesh epic because the Gilgamesh epic is about 2000 BC, whereas Moses was about 1500 BC. But again, we say, well, can we compare them to each other and see, is there really enough to show that one came from the other? Well, the Gilgamesh epic talks about the so-called ark being the shape of a cube, that it was 120 cubits on all sides, 180 feet about. And again, we can just imagine, could this vessel that's really just a cube tumbling around in the ocean really be the appropriate account for this supposed worldwide flood that the Gilgamesh epic talks about? And so we could even say that even though we have these different sources coming from these different nations, rather than saying which one borrowed from the other, we'd say, well, how come these different nations have these stories to begin with? Could it be that they are originating from a true account, but they've become less and less accurate as they've been passed down through time? Just as nowadays we have legends of supposedly historical accounts, that they've added a bunch of things that we would say nowadays that isn't true. It was just added on to make it seem more exciting, or because they perhaps didn't have the information and needed to do a filler. We actually see that there's actually 270 different cultures that talk about a worldwide flood. Again, coming from all parts of the world. This isn't just because of the expansion of Christianity, but even going back to their pagan stories. They'll say, yes, we have a story in our culture, our history of the earth, where there was a worldwide flood that the gods sent upon the earth. And we'll say, why? Why are there so many of these stories of a worldwide flood? Well, it could be because there was a true event that then has been passed on throughout mankind, and each one has taken the story and applied it to their own culture, their own theology. Is very interesting to try to understand. But again, even if we look at the Bible itself, we realize that it's not just once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, but no, that it actually gives very specific details. When it's talking about on the second month of the 17th day of the first year, all of the fountains of the deep burst forth and the rains came down. So we got these specific dates being given throughout the flood account. If you follow it throughout Scripture, he continues to say, well, what time did this happen, and how long did this last, and when did this occur? So we kind of have this ship log of specific dates being given, not just, well, this happened eventually and this and that. So there seems to be much more reliability in this account. Again, what about that 600-year-old Noah? I mean, surely that's preposterous, ridiculous. Who would believe that? Well, again, there actually is, we do see in Scripture that indeed it talks about people living for very long spans of time, upwards of 900 years old, except for this guy right here. Does anyone know who that guy is? Yeah, Enoch. But he didn't actually die at that age. We were told that God took him to be with himself. But pretty much everyone else is living, at least that we have written down, upwards of 900 years. But then after the flood, those lifespans start to go down. There apparently must have been some catastrophic shift, either in the environment or just within mankind's degrading body, that the lifespans are going down. And again, it's interesting to note that there are other documents outside of the Bible that talk about people living for much longer periods of time. One of those is the Sumerian Kings list, which names kings who reigned for long periods of time, upwards of 10,000, 20,000 years. And as much as we would say that might be a little, again, stretching it, it does also talk about them reigning for very long times. Then a great flood came. And then after the flood came, they started ruling for shorter periods of time. It's interesting how that also backs up the same pattern that we see within the Bible. That it's not just the Bible coming up with some random situation, but we see other documents of antiquity talking about these same type of patterns in ancient human history. But of course, people will still say, worldwide flood, ridiculous, preposterous, no way. Well, it is rather interesting that again, some Christians have even taken upon themselves to say, well, because there's so much hostility against this, maybe we've understood the Scriptures wrong, and maybe it wasn't a worldwide flood, maybe it was just a local flood. And so there are some Christians who try to believe the local flood theory because of the ridicule. But again, is it so ridiculous to believe in a massive flood. Maybe not even so much as a worldwide flood, even just a catastrophic flood in general. Because as much as indeed the scriptures, I believe, are saying that it was a worldwide flood, there are some who wonder, could that really be? Could it be that there was such a catastrophic event on Earth? Well, it's interesting, so we actually look at Mars, and they say there was a giant flood on Mars. Did you know that? Yeah, they said that, imagine more than 5 times the volume of water in the Great Lakes being released in a single flood, and you'll have a sense of this event. The force and volume of the water was enough to carve a valley 6,900 feet deep and 550 miles long within a matter of months. So here we have Mars, a giant flood happened on Mars. Well, how much water is on Mars today? Not very much. Some ice caps. How much water is on the Earth? Quite a lot. And it's ridiculous to believe in at least a catastrophic flood. Well, even here, an oceanography textbook says some recent studies suggest that water may have covered the Earth's entire surface some 200 million years before the continents emerged. So here's even someone looking at it through an evolutionary mindset of millions of years and still saying we see some evidence on the Earth that perhaps it was covered by water. And of course, they'll give a different explanation than God's judgment. But even here, we have some other people saying a worldwide flood, catastrophic flood, could be. And again, for those who say maybe it wasn't a worldwide flood, we still have to question, well, then why is Noah building this huge ark if it's just going to be a local flood? I mean, this thing was massive. Why would he need to build such a giant structure? Also, the language of the Bible, talking about all life on earth being blotted out. Why would it say that if it was only just in a small region? Why is Noah taking birds on the ark? They could just fly away if there was a flood. And it talks about water covering the tops of the tallest mountains. Now we may not have very many mountains around here, but if water was covering the top of the water tower and circle, what does that do for the rest of America? Not very good. Most of it's underwater. And the same we would say, of course, for mountains. If you cover up the top of even any general mountain above 10,000 feet, well then almost the rest of the earth is covered. There's no way around it. And it's interesting to note that even at the tops of the tallest mountains, we do find fossils of sea creatures that are up on the tops of those mountains, which would again back up that they were covered under an ocean at some point. We're also told that there was no place for a dove to land when Noah released it. But again, if it was a local flood, doves can fly very far. Why would it not be able to land? Another one that you have is the rainbow. Probably one of the most significant. God's saying, I'll never send a flood like this again. Well, how many local floods have we had since then that have led to the death of many people and animals? We've had many of those. Well, then how do we know if God kept his promise then? If we continue to have local floods that kill mankind and animals? Oh, but if it was a universal flood, indeed, that has never happened since then. And we can look at the rainbow and say God has kept his promise. Another is the duration of the flood. It lasted over a year. Floods don't last that long. And also the next one we'll get into is the geological evidence that points to, indeed, there was catastrophic flooding on the earth. Now again, you may look at something like that. That's the Grand Canyon, and it may look like something from a distance, but once you get up close, you may start to realize that there's something else going on. Because again, the evolutionary mindset will look at that and say, millions of years of slow, gradual erosion, and here we are. But maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe we need to take a closer look. After all, when you look at that, who's that up there? Maybe I'll get a little closer. Who's that? Yeah, it looks like Marilyn Monroe. We get a little closer, and it's not Marilyn Monroe. Indeed, it is. You gotta get. All right, which line is longer?
No, they're both the same.
Yeah, it may look like the top line is longer, but if you actually get a ruler up there and you measure it, the top line is the same length as the bottom one. What shape is that? It's just a cube, right? Well, no, you get a little closer and you realize, oh, that's not a cube.
It's Marilyn Monroe.
Indeed, that's an impossible shape. If you get up close, you realize that's not a cube that's happening up there. And again, when you may look at a hillside, it may look like something from a distance. Again, the evolutionary mindset, millions of years of slow, gradual layers being laid down. But if you look a little closer, you'll say, wait, this is a big boulder sitting here. You know how big that boulder is? It's the size of a dump truck. Now, how did this big boulder the size of a dump truck just get put in with these rock layers that supposedly slowly laid themselves down over millions of years? And there's a lot of other boulders around there, isn't there? Well, how did those boulders end up there if it was just slow, gradual processes? And again, we may look at something like this. And again, it may be hard to see, but over here on the right, you might see some of the lines of different rock layers. But then over here on the left, we have a different type of rock that's wedging itself in between those and pushing the layers down and up. We would say, wait a minute, that was millions of years of slowly layering those down and them hardening. How did this big boulder come in and push those apart? If they were solid rock, how would they bend like that? You know, this is a beautiful mountain. Does anyone know what mountain this used to be? It used to be Mountain St. Helens. Yeah, it was a beautiful mountain until it took up the bad habit of smoking. And then it also began forming craters on the top. And it actually started gaining weight. It was getting bigger. It was gaining as much as 8 feet a day of width on its sides, leading up to a catastrophic landslide, the largest recorded landslide in human history. And that landslide had 1/3 of the mountain sliding off, and it released the pressure that had been building up inside that volcano and exploded out 30 times the power of the bombs of Hiroshima and Kawasaki, those nuclear bombs. The force coming out of this mountain was just so devastating and catastrophic. And thankfully this photographer realized, this is coming right at me, I better take my last shot and get down the hill. And he was able to give us these amazing pictures of the eruption as it took place. And we lost a lot of mountain that day, but where did that mountain go? Well, what goes up must come down. And so we may look at something like this and again say, wow, look at that canyon wall. We got some layers going through there. Let's take millions of years to build that canyon. And look, we even got really fine layers of ash deposits through there. But we'd say, oh, wait a minute. That was only moments that it took of the ash from the Mount St. Helens coming down in sheets, the heavier ash coming down first, and then the next one and the next one, layering themselves down, even in those fine layers. That this canyon was formed in only a matter of hours, if not days at the most. And you know, you can go to the Badlands of South Dakota, and those are also ash layer deposits. And you may look at those, and even a geologist tour might be taking you on and say, yeah, it took millions of years for these to form and to be eroded. Well, you know what? There was actually secondary steam blasts in Mount St. Helens, and when the steam blasts were done, it formed those similar erosion-type features within the ash layers. And this is over a mile wide there in the middle, and that was formed mostly in one day, were these geological formations. And again, you may look at something like this, say, look at that canyon, you know, it's a beautiful canyon, you go looking in there, it's like, oh, it's got this little stream running through there, and again, evolutionary mindset, the little stream must have just been slowly eroding its way through this canyon at the rate, about the rate that it's doing now, and it took a lot of time for it to erode its way through there, but of course, we have eyewitness accounts that said this canyon didn't used to be there prior to Mount St. Helens erupting. No, this canyon was formed after the ash layers went down and then water flow eroded that away. And this idea of catastrophic erosion is something that is documented in many other areas. Here's even National Geographic saying you'd expect this hard rock canyon to be thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years old. But it was cut in less than a decade. Wow, that's pretty powerful. So again, if you have enough water moving through quick enough, it can do a lot of damage. Sometimes we forget the power of water. I've actually been to Glen Canyon Dam in Page, Arizona. It holds back Lake Powell, a very large man-made lake. But you know what? In 1983, they were getting so much water coming into Lake Powell that the dam couldn't get it through its normal systems. And it was about to overrun the top of the dam. They were putting up plywood walls trying to hold back the water from going over the top. And on July 1st, they decided to open the spillways on the sides that they had used while they were constructing the dam to divert the water through these concrete tubes. And they decided to open both of them to try to, again, get as much of that released as they could. But as the days went on, they started hearing loud clanking noises. And they saw large chunks of concrete coming out of those tubes. and eventually the water started to turn red. Why is the water turning red? Well, look, it's a red sandstone canyon. The water is etching into the canyon. And they turned them off and they went inside, and sure enough, it had broken its way through 6 feet of steel-enforced concrete, and it dug into the canyon about a basketball-sized courtyard 60 feet down in a matter of days. And that was because of cavitation, which basically acts like a jackhammer bursting its way through anything in its path because of how much water and force was coming through that pipe. And indeed, there is so much power in water at times that it can cut through anything. Again, we look at something like this, a nice canyon. It's got a much larger river in it that we'd say, okay, maybe that river cut this canyon. Well, actually that river was a result of something called the Missoula flood. And if you go around Missoula and you look up on some of the hillsides, you'll kind of see these lines running along the hillsides. And you think to yourself, why are those lines there? Those aren't man-made lines. They're actually water that had etched into the sides of the hills, because what had happened is during the Ice Age, ice was coming down from Canada, and it cut off a portion of a river up here northwest of Missoula, and the water started getting backed up behind this 2,000-foot ice dam that was 35 miles wide, and it stopped the water from being able to escape. And it built up to a 900 feet deep above Missoula. This huge lake that had built up, it's the size of greater than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined, was built up near Missoula. Well, as you can imagine, an ice dam is not the best thing to build. And eventually the ice dam failed. And so all that water is saying, we need to get to the lowest point, which is the ocean. And so now it's cascading itself down through Idaho, parts of southeast Washington, and along the Columbia River Gorge, along Washington and Oregon, heading to the coast. And it was documented that probably the rate of flow of the water was 10 times that of all the rivers in the world. This was a powerful amount of water rushing through very rapidly. And I've actually been to Dry Falls, Washington. And they call it Dry Falls because there's no longer a waterfall there anymore. But there used to be. And why is that? Well, again, because of what they found out about this Missoula flood that used to be rushing through here at one point. Now, again, maybe for some perspective, Niagara Falls is a mile wide and 165-foot drop, but Dry Falls in Washington is 3.5 miles wide and a 400-foot drop. That this massive waterfall was once flowing at one point and ultimately etching its way through the canyon until it eventually ran out of steam here. And so again, this canyon was formed as this huge amount of water was pouring through parts of Washington and busting its way through this basalt solid rock around it, this canyon, forming it in less than 2 days. And again, this is a huge canyon. It's over 400 feet deep. It stretches for over 20 miles. That this water was cutting this out in a day or two. Another evidence of this is, look at this boulder that these people are sitting on. You know, if you were to turn the camera around, you wouldn't see any cliffs for miles. And this type of rock is different than the ground that it's sitting on. So where did this rock come from? And not only that, look at these other rocks that are all strung around. These what are called erratic boulders. Where are all these big boulders coming from? And again, near the Snake River Plain in Twin Falls, Idaho, you'll also see these erratic boulders sitting all over the place. Where are the cliffs that these boulders came from? Well, if you go to Salt Lake City, you'll see this, again, this etched line sometimes on the hillsides. That's not a man-made line. That's where it used to be a lake, Lake Bonneville. And it was a lake that they believe was built up by a landslide that, again, cut off a river supply and built up water behind it until eventually that dam failed. And here's a rendition of how big they believe Lake Bonneville was before the earth dam failed, and then all that water needed to escape down the Snake River Canyon. And again, here's a plaque that I took a picture of when I went through the Snake River Canyon. It says, during the peak, the flow of the Bonneville flood through the canyon reached 33 million cubic feet per second. So take 374 Olympic-sized swimming pools and shoot them past you every second. That's how much water was flowing through the Snake River Canyon and ultimately carving out this canyon, this massive canyon, 500 feet high, 50 miles long. Again, the power of water. We don't always realize how powerful it can be, and even rapidly creating these canyons. And here's Twin Falls, Idaho, and you may look at, again, these nice, they're relatively nice, especially around here, these waterfalls. But again, you look around and say, well, if those are just those little two waterfalls, how come there's so much of a down off that cliff? Why does it extend so wide? Oh, because there used to be a much larger waterfall flowing over and etching its way up to this point till it finally ran out of steam. And you know those erratic boulders that we were looking at? Well, they were up on top of those cliffs above the Snake River Canyon. So this water is not only plowing through the canyon, but it's even over the canyon. And it's leaving these boulders that it's ripping up somewhere, and then it's just losing steam across the field. It's dropping those boulders and leaving them on top of the canyon. And you actually will see evidence of these in other countries as well. In Siberia, a flow that they said was 100 times the flow of all rivers combined, etched out some geological features there. Here's wave rock in Australia, stretches for 7 miles. I wonder how that was formed. So again, it's not so much that time, if we just have a little bit of water for enough time, that we're going to necessarily get all the geological features we see today. But instead, the conditions are right. If we just have enough water in a short amount of time, then indeed we can still get massive canyons. So again, when we see something, we need to be careful to say, is it really how we perceive it to be? Or do we need to look closer and say, maybe we're not seeing things properly? And again, something like this in the canyon lands, that we may look at that and say, oh man, millions of years of erosion. Or perhaps maybe if there was a worldwide flood and all that water is rushing off of the land into the ocean, that perhaps it could have been carving out these freshly deposited rock layers. Now again, the standard interpretation of evolutionary mindset is millions of years of gradual erosion. Basically a lot of time and a little bit of water. But again, we can see that if you have a lot of water, you can carve out canyons in a short amount of time. This you will not find in a more secular textbook, but some believe that there was indeed a blocked up lakes that were here before the Grand Canyon, that these lakes may have also failed like the ones we saw up in Salt Lake and Missoula, and maybe they were the ones that carved the Grand Canyon. Because again, we see that original cliffside that I showed you with the large boulders, those are actually further down the Grand Canyon, that we'd say, oh yes, indeed, if there was a large rush of water ripping up those boulders and then laying them down in these rock layers, then that would make sense as to how those massive boulders got stuck there. So indeed, the Grand Canyon could have been carved, possibly, in weeks, rather than millions of years of slow, gradual erosion. Now again, some people might say, well, what about radiometric dating methods that supposedly prove how old rock layers are? Well, you know what? They've done radiometric dating of Mount St. Helens, of some of those layers, to see, okay, how long does it say, how old was that rock? Well, we get about 340,000 to 2.8 million years old, were those the ash and rock layers that came out of the volcano. We say, well, that's not true, because we saw when it erupted and when those rock layers were laid down. So that can't be accurate. And they've again looked at some other ones in New Zealand, another one that people have eyewitness seen erupt. And again, we're getting way higher numbers than there should be. Even recent flows in Hawaii, they'll take some of those and test them according to the radiometric dating, and they'll get about 3 million to 1 billion years old. We say, there seems to be something wrong here. Here's a cross-section of part of Grand Canyon. And again, there was a recent lava flow in a portion of the Grand Canyon that Native Americans said that they were eyewitnesses to this lava flow way in the past. Well, they've done radiometric dating on that lava flow, which should be much younger than these other layers down here. But again, we're getting numbers to where actually that recent lava flow is dated as sometimes older than these rock layers way down here. And again, this doesn't seem to match up. And so my professor at Alpha Lake Institute, Dave Nutting, he asked a ranger at the Grand Canyon and said, how come when we test these on these new rock layers, we're getting these way off numbers? And he said, well, because it doesn't work on newly formed rock layers, it only works on really old ones. And of course the question is, okay, so basically radiometric dating doesn't work on rocks we know how old they are, but it does work on rocks we have no idea how old they are. That doesn't seem to match up. And again, if the Bible is true and we look at the rock layers, we would expect to find, as Ken Ham would say, millions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Well, indeed, when we look at the rock layers, we find millions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Just as we'll find oysters and clams, and when clams die, usually they open up. But we'll find clams that are still closed and fossilized, which means they were buried while they were alive and they couldn't dig their way out. Massive burials, and we see, again, massive burials even within the Grand Canyon. There's a type of a squid-like shell similar to the ones I have out there, that again, ocean-bearing creature, but they're buried in massive layers there in the Grand Canyon. We also will find in Butte National Monument also these fish, massive burials of these fish that are just so well preserved. I mean, look at that one, not even a scale out of place for that fish. Clearly it didn't just die and float down to the bottom and get eaten by something as it was decaying, but it must have been buried so rapidly that it didn't even rot any of the scales. Here's even a palm leaf. Hardly there's anything damaged on the palm leaf itself etched into it. It must have been buried very rapidly and didn't decay. Here's even a fish that was busy eating its lunch when it got buried by something. Rapid burial, fast. And we also see that, of course, for dinosaur bones. You'll see that here as well. People are digging some up near here in Montana and abroad. Massive burial, some dinosaurs, so many together, buried together. Well, you know, my professor, Dave Nutting, again, when he looks at features like this, he starts to get hungry, he says. Because when he looks at those, he thinks of pancakes, you know, all these nice layers of rock, and they just make him think of these nice stacked pancakes that you just pour them out. Well, what if, again, if those pancakes were like these rock layers that's forcibly, you know, poured out over thousands of years, had to harden, and then the next layer poured out, and it would harden, and so forth, up and up in the line. Well, what happens whenever you find a tree that's fossilized going through many layers? What's called a polystrate fossil. Poly being many, straight strata fossil. It's going through many strata of rock layers. And again, if that's at least thousands of years of those rock layers, how did that tree just keep sitting there and just slowly get buried without ever decaying and falling apart for thousands of years? How did that get there? And you'll see those. See these here? These are fossilized trees, pillars going up. There's another one over there going through many layers of rock. And there's a closer picture of them. Fossilized trees going straight up through many layers of rock. And you'll often find there's no roots. There's no roots at the bottom. Why is that? Well, possibly because they were ripped out of wherever they were and then stuck in a position and then buried by the rest of the rocks. Here's another polystrate fossil. Again, going through many layers of rock. How did it get there? Well, again, that would make sense if we have this worldwide flood that's just wiping things out and then burying certain things under rock layers to the point where they can get enough heat and pressure to be able to fossilize. Now again, if we try to take this pancake situation seriously, what happens if we have the bottom layer of the pancake suddenly decide to shoot up through the rest of the pancakes and even straight through the butter? That would be quite impressive, would it not? Well, you know, we actually find that in geology. We actually find these rock layers that just shot up through the rest of them, and it's sticking up through the top. And I've actually been there to see these structures. There I am. There's one. That's just, it's a different rock layer than the ones around it. It's going way deep, and it's shooting up through the rest, and the top rock layers that are weaker have eroded away, but this is a stronger type. It's not eroding as fast, and so now it's left just standing up. But how did it do that? If each rock layer had to solidify, how did that bottom one stay fluid and somehow push its way through the rest of them? That doesn't make any sense unless they were all still relatively fluid And the pressure caused, for whatever reason, that bottom one to shoot up through the rest of the soft rock layers. And again, this flood must have been very catastrophic. So much power could have been currents up to 150 miles per hour going across the surface of the earth below the water. How much damage could have been done. And we actually see what's called, you'll see in geology, it's called the Great Unconformity. Where basically, again, here's that cross-section of the Grand Canyon. You see how those rock layers are kind of diagonal and these are more flat? Well, you'll actually see that across the whole earth, that there seemed to be something that scraped off whatever used to be going along those more diagonal. It just scraped off that and then laid them flat on top of that. And that's called the Great Unconformity, because they're like, how did this happen? Why is everything suddenly different when you get to that point where now they're suddenly laying more flat on top of it? And even here we have, here's again the Grand Canyon. This pink section is a piece of Shinomu quartzite. Well, that comes again from this bottom layer, but it's stuck in a Tapete sandstone layer up above it, as if it was ripped out and then stuck inside this newer layer on top. Well, how did that happen? How do you have rock layers jumping up a level? Well, it must have been something catastrophic to take it out of its place and then stick it in a new level as it was being laid out. And we do see, again, what my professor would say, we do see pancake layers stretching really big. I mean, that light color, that's one rock layer stretching all the way up into Iceland, that you'll find up in northern Iceland, stretching all the way down to Texas and all the way over there to the east. That's one rock layer that was laid out by water at some point. Geologists have to admit, all that was laid down at the same time by one water situation. That's a big pancake, you would say. And we also find those even stretching across the United States, and sometimes they'll have different names. So again, we have Redwall, Madison, Indiana, but these are all the same limestone layers. They're just given different names in different areas. And here's another one that actually stretches from Colorado all the way across to England. They're the White Cliffs of Dover, are made of this same material, and it even stretches all the way to Israel. We have rock layers stretching across to different continents. That those are the same material that was laid out at some point. Now, yes, it was cut out by the ocean, but the layer is still there where it was left on the continents. Even huge pancakes, he would say. So again, the Bible, or the Noah's flood, we would say, man, there is so much that backs up that indeed there must have been a worldwide flood event, because supported even by non-biblical documentations talk about a worldwide flood. We even have this geological evidence that points to some type of catastrophic flooding across much of the earth, if not all of the earth, at the same time. And so again, the question that we have to ask ourselves, do we believe that Noah's flood is truly a historical event? Do we believe what the Bible has to say about it? And if we do believe that, then we also realize that there's much more the Bible says as well that we can believe as well, and that's that as much as the Noah's flood was a judgment upon mankind and many lives were lost, guess what? Noah found favor with God. He was declared righteous in God's sight, not because of anything he'd done, but because he had faith in the one who could make him righteous. And indeed, we have that same opportunity today, we're told in the Bible, that we too can be saved from the coming judgment that is going to befall the earth again. Not water, but fire. And we are told in the Bible that we can be saved from that if we have faith in God and his way of salvation. So if we believe that indeed God saved Noah through the way that he promised him, then we can believe what perhaps this person, Jesus Christ, says, that we can be saved from the coming judgment in the future. That both of those, again, back up that all the Bible is true, that we can take to heart. And indeed, hopefully you have put your faith in the God who delivers from judgment. Are there any questions at this time?
Does the secular world give any explanation for why all these things happen that contradict the evolutionary process?
Yeah. What it tends to be is, instead of all all the world covered at one point, they'll say all the world was covered in different sections. So eventually you had the west coast of America, you could say. It suddenly fell into the ocean covered it, and then it rose back up. And then you have the Central America. It fell into the ocean covered, and then it decided to rise back up. Then you have Europe, it fell eventually in a million years, and so they just spread it out and say it was multiple events of the earth being covered by water at different times, but not all at once. Because they do have to agree that these rock layers were laid down by water. There's no way around it. But they'll say it wasn't a worldwide event, it was just slow, accidental ups and shifts of the Earth's surface that eventually caused all that to happen.
One slide that you showed there with the trees that were up the rock cliff with no roots or anything. When they, Lake Yellowstone, when they lost the side of that mountain, I've seen pictures of trees that did that same thing. They had no roots, but they were floating this way. And then when the dirt and everything come around them, that same thing happened. It just gives you proof that it's not mystic. That thing actually happened that way.
Yeah, we're actually able to almost see the process in real time with, what's happening with those trees that were just obliterated, ripped out of their roots, then thrown in the lake, and then, got so soaked with water that they sunk down the mud, and the ash and stuff is building up around them.